the United Nations in the last 5 years has come out, and here's where we start to get down the path a little bit to the good news here. I'm going to try to take us down this path pretty quickly here. The United Nations in the last 5 years has come out with 4 reports that have given us an entirely different vision now, that I think one could put on this timeline now for this beyond the neocolonic era, and we could begin to see some ways in which we can do this. The first report was called Agriculture at a Crossroads. And this was a report put together by, I remember the number, like 400 scientists, and they were focusing primarily on the developing world, places like Africa, where we know the major sources of hunger are. And the reason to say agriculture at the crossroads is because they're saying the way that we've gone in the past with the Green Revolution, etc., is not going to solve the problem in places like Africa. We've got to fundamentally come up with a different system. And the different system is one which looks at the need to work with farmers in their own communities, with their own resources, and their own ecological capital, in their own communities, and help them to put farming systems together that enable them to produce food in their own communities. So it's not a matter of farmers in Canada and the United States feeding people in Africa. It's a matter of enabling farmers in Africa to feed their own populations. And there are examples of that taking place right now, which are proving to be enormously successful. So that's one report. The second report, which came out shortly after that, is called The Right to Food, which he basically said the same thing. It's the social capital, it's the natural capital, which we have to improve and enable these new systems to emerge. And it's the cooperation among farmers working together that enables this to happen. And particularly important, each of these reports have said, is to pay attention to women, because about 70% of the world's farmers are women, so you have to work with women in these communities in order to make this happen. And then the third report, which came out after that, is called Save and Grow, essentially the same message. And then finally, the one that came out most recently called Toward the Future We Want. Now, all 4 of these reports, put together by scientists who have looked at this need to redesign the system, to answer this question mark on Ernst-Schuske's timeline about the agriculture of the future. Now, there's some other good news here in terms of the fact that there are farmers, there are researchers, there are people in communities who have begun to use these basic ideas in terms of this new direction that we need to be moving in. So let me just give you a couple quick examples. The Land Institute at Salina, Kansas, under the leadership of Wes Jackson, has been working through natural selection, a breeding process in over 30 years, to convert annual plants to perennials, and to take perennial plants and through a breeding process, make them more productive so that they produce more of the right kinds of seeds that we need, so that we can essentially convert our agriculture system from an annual crop system to a perennial crop system. And Wes has said, the reason for this is because, going to agriculture 10 or 11,000 years ago was a mistake to begin with, because it wasn't that the problem was the way we were doing agriculture, the problem was agriculture. And what we did, instead of looking at nature, and how nature, who's been on the planet a lot longer than we have, how nature has put systems together. Nature doesn't operate on the basis of annuals, or let alone specialization in monocrops. Nature operates on the basis of perennials and mixtures. And so they have been doing research now for 30 years. When Wes actually did this, as many times, in our culture, and John Huber knows all about this, when somebody comes along with a new idea within the scientific community, you tend to be, if not demonized, at least dismissed. And Wes Jackson was one of those people who said, well, look, he said, a plant is going to do one of 2 things. It's either going to put its energy into the root system, which means you're not going to get any seeds, or it's going to put the energy into seeds, which means you're not going to have the root system. You got to make a choice between perennials and annuals. Wes, of course, was a geneticist, and he knew that biology was a little more complex than that. He simply didn't believe that, and he continued to work with it. And now he's beginning to be recognized. As a matter of fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal had 2 articles which praised Wes Jackson and his work. And, that was sort of the last place I expected it to happen. But nevertheless, and here's why this is important, because if we, and Wes and his scientists have now demonstrated that if we were to put the right amount of effort into our research projects in institutes, just talking about the United States, It's happening around the world too, because there are perennial rice varieties now being developed in China, for example. But nevertheless, if you just look at it in terms of the United States, Wes has calculated that if we were to invest $50 million a year for the next 50 years, that 50 years from now, we could have 60% of our annual crops in the United States in perennials. And $50 million a year, given the kind of money that USDA spends on research, is not that much. And if you think about it, if we had 60% of our crops as perennial crops instead of annual crops, and then you start thinking about the heartland and the overall aquifer, the perennial root system has root systems that go into the ground 15 to 18 feet instead of 15 to 18 inches, and in the diameter of 15 to 18 inches instead of 2 to 3 inches. So the amount of services that those perennial root systems provide, not only in terms of accessing the water that needs it in drought periods, but accessing nutrients and restoring the biological health of the soil, creating the kind of community for the biological activity in the soil. And this is where I mentioned earlier about my TEDx talk about this. One of the things I tried to convey to the population in urban center in New York was that the soil isn't just dirt. The soil is a biologically active community. There's more biological life beneath the surface of the soil than there's above the surface of the soil. And these perennial root systems help to provide the habitat for that biological life in the soil. So another good quick example. A friend of mine who's an agronomist at Iowa State University by the name of Matt Liebman has been doing some research which we partly helped to fund. It started at the Leopold Center. And Matt became convinced that part of our problem was this specialization problem. And so he wanted to demonstrate through actual in-the-field research what benefits you could get from a fairly simple crop rotation. So that instead of just corn and soybeans, you have a crop rotation with a little bit more diversity. And so what he did was set up this experiment. And so he had the corn-soybean rotation with the traditional inputs that farmers use, synthetic nitrogens, etc. to grow that. So that was in 4 acres of the research plot. And the other 4 acres he divided up into 2 research plots. One which had a 3-crop rotation, corn and soybeans, and then a small grain with red clover to serve as a green manure cover crop. And then a modest amount of livestock manure. And then in the other 2 acres, a 4-crop rotation with corn and beans, a small grain with alfalfa, and then a second year of alfalfa, again with a modest amount of livestock manure. Everything else in that research was exactly the same. We used the same seed, planted at the same time, harvested at the same time, etc. The only thing that was different was the 2-crop and the 3-crop, 4-crop rotation. Well, he's been able to demonstrate now, after 8 years of research, that in the 3-crop and 4-crop rotation, farmers can save 97%, reduce their pesticide input by 97%. They can reduce their fertilizer input by almost 90%. And return on land and labor is actually slightly higher because the yields are slightly higher. Now, even inside the university, Matt has never gotten much recognition for the results of this research. But finally, again, this is part of the good news, here just in the last couple of weeks, and partly because Mark Bittman picked up on this and did an article about it in the New York Times. Now Matt's all over the map, and this research is all over the map, and also partly because of the drought and the impact of that, and people seeing that this is a benefit from this. Now, you say, well, okay, how come every farmer in Iowa isn't adopting this? Well, because we have a market infrastructure that's pressuring them to produce as much corn and soybeans as possible, because that's what the system's demanding. But there are an increasing number of farmers now that are beginning to do that and beginning to look at that, because they know that in the long term, and this is where the resilience issue comes in, that this is going to provide a more resilient food system for themselves. One of the other examples which individual farmers are doing, we're going to have a workshop about it this afternoon, so I won't go into detail on that. It's permaculture. It's amazing things that farmers are doing. Permaculture is primarily a system where you don't have any waste, because the waste, you have the kind of complexity of species where the waste from one species becomes the food for another. And again, in terms of these kinds of challenges we're going to be facing, that's a direction we need to move in. And then finally, another example is in terms of agroforestry, which is being developed a lot from the global south now. And again, if you're interested in exploring more of that, Yvette Perfecto and John Bandelier and Angus Wright published a book a couple of years ago called Nature's Matrix, which they go into great detail about this and how actually these agroforestry systems, which farmers are now putting in place of what used to be these monocultures, is now producing more food, creating the kind of biodiversity which is creating resilient systems. So again, it's a direction. Now we got a lot more work to do, we got a lot more research to do, we have a lot more imagination we all need to do together, and we need to have a lot more information from all of the farmers who are going to be wrestling with these issues on their own farms, because a lot of these solutions, as a matter of fact, I would argue almost all of these solutions are going to be local solutions. That is, they're going to be adapted to their own local ecologies. So what works for a permaculture farmer in southern Japan, who's one of my heroes, is not going to work on my farm in North Dakota because it's an entirely different ecology. So these are all some of the kinds of things we need to